Nobody talks about how well developed the tax infrastructure of Brazil is. It's very cumbersome, but it's very digitalized. And together with the digitalization of payments, the government saw an opportunity to get businesses out of informality into formality.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today I'm very excited with our guest. We have Jorge Vargas Neto, the CEO and co-founder of BHub, a back office as a service platform serving companies here in Brazil. Jorge, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Such a pleasure to be here. Very honored and happy to share a couple of thoughts on the difficult ecosystem that we find ourselves in.
Yes, I'm very excited about this podcast. We're going to talk about taxes and business setup, things that usually people try to ignore. But I think the BHub saying is you focus on the business and you take care of the rest. So we're hoping that you can tell us exactly how that works and we don't have to worry about it much beyond that. So again, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I hope that by the end of this conversation, we make sure that DAF and taxes, even though they are surety, they don't happen at least in the same time, if everything that is involved in the tax scene in Brazil, right?
Yes, that's what we're here to talk about. But before we dive into the main problems that you guys focus on, or the main areas that you focus on, rather, I would love to know a little bit more about your journey. So you're a serial entrepreneur. BHub is not your first company. So maybe just briefly, you could share a little bit about yourself and your background.
Perfect. I started my career as a lawyer in a big law firm here in Brazil called Pinheiro Neto. I had the honor and pleasure to serve as a trainee and eventually as an associate with Bruno Balducini, which is a leading lawyer here in the country. And he served like a mentor for me, almost like a second father. I learned a lot from him. And within the journey, working as an associate in the firm, I was exposed to these amazing entrepreneurs like Davi Vélez from the bank, Sergio Fulio from Creditas. We were in the midst of a new regulation that got enacted to regulate the Brazilian payment system. And by participating in this very challenging, but also extremely amazing opportunity in this changing of regulation, I left the firm and I had to try it my own way and try the hard way, right? Because then I learned what real struggle is.
It's different thinking about being an entrepreneur than being an entrepreneur for sure.
True story. True story. I had to learn this struggle myself.
We're excited to chat with you and learn about some of the things you saw. So before we get into BHub itself and what you're doing there, can you tell us a little bit about why you created BHub? What were the problems that you saw as an entrepreneur or as a lawyer that you said, I need to build something to fix this? What were the issues that you saw as opportunities?
Perfect. So I started as an entrepreneur when I was 24 years old and with a law degree. So I didn't have any experience in running a business whatsoever, not even a lemonade neighborhood store, nothing. And then I quickly realized that doing business in Brazil is quite tricky. We have very cumbersome set of regulations and ancillary obligations, which are intrinsic part when you're running a business. So we basically had a relationship with an accounting firm, and we had two companies. Both of them were sold to bigger companies. Both were unicorns, like PagSeguro was the first one, and the second one was Rappi. Both journeys were very painful. So it sounds much better than the reality was, but thanks God, everything worked fine in the end. But this second part actually was precisely what led us to found BHub. The reason being, we had to perform a quick sale of the company, the second one, which was called Zen Finance, because we actually had a Series A term sheet signed, but this thing got dropped because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we found ourselves into these very troublesome waters. And we basically were forced to sell the companies to one of our partners. We were accredited as a service platform. And then once we had all signed, we took them to the accounting firm that was serving us. And they basically raised a hand and said, hey, congratulations, you need to pay your capital gain taxes.
Always fun.
Yeah, I would love to be paying, this capital gain taxes if I had the capital gain. But in fact, we're just paying back the liquidation preference. So to make a long story short, we eventually realized that for these 2.5 years of this second company's journey, they didn't perform their job correct. So basically, there is this procedure called patrimonialization, which is to register some of the expenses incurred in the creation of a product as an intangible asset so as to avoid this capital gain taxation. But this thing was not performed correctly, and we had to redo all our bookkeeping from scratch within these 3 to 4 days in order to pay back the investors. So it was very annoying, a very tough experience. But nowadays, I'm very grateful for that because this was precisely what gave us the idea of creating this back office as a service platform.
Yeah, sounds like a really fun time, a great party there for those 3 or 4 days of probably all-nighters rebuilding your accountings. But it sounds like it worked out, like you said, and that it gave you this great idea. And now you're working with BHub, and we're a client in all transparency at Teddy, and we enjoy, as am I, as an individual. Yeah, happy to be clients. We continue to talk about things we can do together. But if I understand it correctly, and I want to speak at a high level, and so I'm probably overgeneralizing, but my understanding of BHub is that you focus on 2 main areas. So one, in terms of setting up and managing a business, things like opening a business, what type of company to open. So are you an Ireli or a Limitada? Making sure the company has its licenses and things along those lines in terms of managing and running the company. Are you clear with your fire exit procedures, things like that? And on the other side, more around accounting and financial planning. And so these are both awesome topics, real bureaucratic mazes in Brazil. Opening and managing a business and understanding taxes and accounting are things that entrepreneurs have to deal with, but really don't want to. And so I want to get into both of these 2 areas, but maybe we can start with the business setup and management services. So can you tell us a little bit about what are the types of business structures that people or businesses can have in Brazil? And what are the decisions that go into whether to choose one structure or another? So if I'm a small business and if I'm opening a small business, what are my options and what am I thinking about? And likewise, if I'm a contractor or a solo entrepreneur, what am I thinking about? If I'm a foreign company opening up some sort of affiliate here in Brazil, what am I thinking about? So maybe we can start with that business opening. What are the types of companies? What are the considerations in terms of how I want to structure myself?
Perfect. So that is separating in 2 parts here. So one is, let's say, the legal types of structures, the corporate types that are valid in Brazil. Basically, there is this Ireli, like you said, which is, let's say, the company of one. So you have a single partner that is Ireli. You also have a Limitada, which is similar to an LLC in the US or a Gesellschaft in Germany. So you have this limited liability entity, which also recently you are also authorized to have a single partner or a single member owning such entity. And then you have also the corporation, which in Brazil is called Sociedade Anônima. So those are the main types of legal entities in Brazil. There are other types. There is called Sociedade Simples, but these work only for professional entities. So these are not considered as a proper entity that aims to have profit. Let's not talk about it. And moving on to the second part of the question, which is the tax regimes that are applicable to those corporate types. So for the tax regimes, you basically have 4 options. So the first option is MEI. MEI is like micro entrepreneur individual. So it's a business of one and it has a very favorable tax regime, but you can only have up to 80,000 reais as revenue within a year. So this is very common for contractor of companies. So in Brazil, it's very common to use contractors. This has been authorized ever since 2018. So it's become more and more common. And if you pay, let's say, the contract value is up to 80,000 reais a year, then the MEI structure is very favorable because you pay 60 reais a month. So not real taxes here.
Not very much. Yeah,
exactly. The second alternative is called Simples. Simples is basically, again, very favorable tax regime, but the companies need, in order to adhere to the simple tax regime, you need to make up to 4.8 million reais a year. And it's also very restricted in terms of what types of companies can adhere to this tax regime. So for instance, if you do financial service, you're not allowed to have a simple tax regime. And if you have a foreign entity as one of the corporation of the legal entity, you are not allowed to have this simple tax regime. Also, if you have more than one company, you cannot adhere to such tax regime. So it's incentivized. Usually you pay around 6%, could be even less, but it's again, also very restrictive. It is interesting because you don't have to have proper bookkeeping. With the revenue that you make, there is established what is the taxes that you need to pay. So you just need to inform what was your revenue, then the tax is calculated. So it's not common for the companies that have, simple tax regime. They don't need a proper accrual basis accounting. So it's much simpler accounting.
Very interesting. So you mentioned that with the first type, it's more of an independent contractor, somebody that's not making, a tremendous amount of money, kind of class B, class C. Who is opening this second type, the MEI?
I would say it's a small business. It's the most common apart from contractors. So which is this business of one.
Contractors that make more. Yeah.
Yeah. But then simple is very common. One thing to bear in mind is we are in the midst of this discussion of having a new tax regulations, and simple is going to be kept out of these new regulations. It's once again, it's very, like the name say itself, is very simple treatment, but it's restrictive. It only applies to real small business, mostly family-owned business, and with a specific National Code of Economic Activities, which is called KINAI. With every time that you incorporate your company, you need to select which KINAI code, National Code of Economic Activity, that applies to your business. Yes. Then you have something called Lucro Presumido, which, let's say, translation would be like presumed profit. So again, from the revenue that you make, there is a presumption of taxes that you need to apply. So for instance, if you do like consulting, KINAI code, you have 15% taxation, if I'm not mistaken, if you have like this presumable profit tax regime. And this works from 4.8 million up to around 80 million, which then you are also required to opt for this, let's say, accrual basis accounting. And then this last regime, it starts with 34% taxation. So you can see, so coming from 60 reais a month to 34%. So there's quite a difference, but there's a benefit from the last option, the Lucro Real, which is the following. You only pay income taxes if you make profit. So it's quite common that startups opt for this last tax regime because in the end of the day, you only pay taxes if you make money. And actually the losses that you accumulate, they can be in the future deducted from the profit that you make. So it's very interesting, especially for types of companies that are burning cash, at least for a time. It is also mandatory for financial service and a couple of other types of KINAI codes.
Very, very interesting. So you already talked a little bit about taxes, but I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper here. So the easy question, how do Brazilian taxes work? You talked a little bit about the tax regimes, but what are the main types of taxes that a business is going to have to pay? How do they work and what do people tend to struggle with or mix up? Moving from the business setup to the accounting and financial planning piece, what are the things people are concerned with and where do you really add value?
Perfect. So firstly, in Brazil, it's like we were saying, it's very complex environment to do business at. So it's very cumbersome and you need to create this strategy from the beginning. So depending if you're making profit, so probably you should not go for this, let's say, Lucro Real. So it's part of this tax regime selection is already tax planning. Moving to the other taxes. So you have direct taxes, which is income taxes, basically. And then we have indirect taxes. Indirect taxes, we have ICMS, which is a taxes linked to the selling of products. And this changes state to state, the state level regulation. Then you have service taxes, which is ISS. And this changes from municipality to municipality. It's a municipal level taxation. And then we have other indirect taxes, such as IOF, which is a taxes applicable to financial operations. So every time that you, let's say, close a transaction, you need to pay IOF taxes. Every time that you make a purchase with your credit card, you take a loan, you are paying IOF taxes. We also have this IPI, which is a taxes linked to the importation of goods or services. And there's also PIS and COFINS, which are also our indirect taxes, which are mandatory contributions. And there's also CSLL, which is again a mandatory contribution applicable to the income that your company makes. So again, a lot of taxes, and there's a lot of tax planning that you can do depending on the selection of the municipality. For instance, if you're doing a service company online, it's very interesting for you to select a municipality that has incentives for you to localize your company in this municipality. So for instance, just nearby São Paulo, there is Osasco and Barueri. Those two cities, they apply service taxes of 2%, whereas São Paulo applies a taxes of 5% for this exact same KINAI code. So there's a lot of planning that you can do. And there's also this bureaucracy stuff. So there's additional ancillary obligations. So for instance, ever since the past couple of years, the government has increased the level of bureaucracy in order to assess what is the income of companies. So they are trying to get out of this informality so as to eventually apply taxes. And they are increasing the level of bureaucracy for these ancillary obligations. That's some sort of mandatory contribution / taxes. So for instance, payroll, on average, you pay 85% taxes on your payroll. And there's also, again, mandatory contributions linked to payroll, such as mandatory pension plans, those type of contributions.
Yeah, very interesting. If I can go a little bit deeper here, and I don't know how much you know about it, but what led to the different types of tax regimes? So why are some at a state level? Why are some at a municipal level? And what led to that complexity?
That is a complicated question, and it's just an opinion. I think that in the beginning, we didn't have any taxation, right? We were in a monarchy. Brazil was a colony of Portugal. Then it became a state part of the Portuguese royalty. And then eventually we became a republic. And in the beginning, it was a very elite-driven government. So we have very little taxes, and it was a lot of debt incurring in order to help the plantation population that we had here at the business. And then these things got evolved in the mid-30s. We had a very, let's say, some sort of left-wing dictatorship here, which was the Era Vargas.
More populist.
Yeah, more populist. And this was a time in which the labor laws were created in Brazil. The syndicates were created in Brazil. And then we started to see the government becoming heavier and heavier. And we again got back to a democratic republic, but for a short period. And then we got a dictatorship, which was right-wing, but very heavy government. And then it created most of the federal states that we have here in Brazil and the Congress, etc. And this became very heavy. So within this moment that we created several of the taxations that we have currently in place in order to finance the bigger government that were created. And even so, we still had an enormous level of debt that was incurred in order to create the roadways, railways that we have in Brazil. And once we got back to the most recent constitution, which was in 1988, then was still another level of tax that were created. And we continue to experience that. And the jurisprudence can changes every time. So it's a crazy tax environment.
Yeah, bureaucracy is hard to dismantle. But I think that's the biggest thing is once you have bureaucracy, you just end up patching more things on top instead of taking things away. Benefits are the same way, right? So once you create expectations of benefits, it's hard to take them away. And it boggles the mind that different municipalities have different tax regimes, especially where e-commerce factors in. And I don't know if e-commerce is taxed based on the source of the e-commerce or the recipient of the e-commerce. So in the US, you'll be taxed based on the product, based on where it's sent. So if I use Amazon in the US and I send it to New York, I pay New York taxes versus if I send it to Virginia, I pay Virginia taxes. And here I imagine there's just even more complexity.
There is even more complexity, but it's similar. Usually that is the regulation of this ICMS, which is the tax applicable to the selling of goods, either online or locally. But yes, usually you pay the taxes of the destiny. But again, there is a mixed jurisprudence in that regard. If you're producing in a state, but let's say, in order to produce your goods, you had to buy from another state. So there is a discussion in that regard. So it's extremely complex. And most tax disputes that we have is linked to ISMS, but there was a new regulation regarding, let's say, this indirect tax that was creating this EVA, which is taxes linked to the aggregated value that is generated linked to a product. And it creates this EVA, which is two taxes, CBS and IBS. And this is going to simplify this specific issue that you described, which is this destination, et cetera, is going to have an standardized taxes to be applicable depending on the product that you sell. So depending on the KNI code, this is going to drastically simplify the tax treatment for the selling of goods, but it will also drastically increase the taxation that is currently applicable. So on average, you usually pay 11.25% current, and the minimum tax is going to be 24% as soon as this new regulation gets into effect, which is expected to happen in 2026.
That's going to be painful. But that's also a nice transition to my next question. So I think that, in other episodes, we've talked about this, that over the last few years, Brazilian regulators have really taken steps to improve competitiveness and innovation in a number of segments. I've talked a lot about fintech on this podcast, in part because I worked in fintech and I'm a bit of a fintech nerd. And they're really great examples in terms of even what you talked about there in terms of the work that you did with Creditas and Nubank around the new licenses for financial services and how the central bank has really worked to encourage the development of new financial solutions to encourage financial access. It seems like there's been less innovation around simplifying business administration and taxation. So what innovation has there been? So you just talked about this EVA, but what innovation has there been in terms of accounting and business administration over the last 5-10 years? And what has it been that's held up this innovation?
I love your question. So everybody talks about how well developed is the financial infrastructure of Brazil, especially the payment infrastructure.
There are some really cool things.
Yeah.
Instant payments picks. And I really like the nota fiscal electrónico. So the registered electronic receipt that the government implemented so that they know what taxes to charge you, right? I think that's really cool.
Exactly. And this precisely leads to the fact that I was going to mention, which is nobody talks about how well developed the tax infrastructure of Brazil is. It's very cumbersome, but it's very digitalized. And together with the digitalization of payments that has experienced a very strong secular tailwind ever since the COVID-19 with the PIX expansion, the government saw that and saw an opportunity to get businesses out of informality into formality. And it basically increased the level of bureaucracy in the form of additional reporting requirements that became applicable to mainly Lucro Presumido and Lucro Real tax regime companies. But eventually, I do believe that this is going to be applicable to every single business in Brazil. And basically, what this caused is, so in the beginning, you usually just had the nota fiscal, as you said, but right now, every business need to, if you are Lucro Presumido and Lucro Real, you need to issue ECD, ECF, REIF every single September. So there's a lot of ancillary obligation, ancillary reporting requirements that the business owners need to comply with. But the problem is that they are not capable to do that. And the usual suspects, which are the accounting firms, they are not prepared either. So basically, these are mom and pop's business. They cannot afford to invest in technology and invest in CS. So basically, these accounting firms, which the business owners rely upon in order to comply with the taxes and this ancillary obligation, they are not being able to comply with. So basically, there is a lot of penalties that are being incurred by the business owners. And these accounting firms, they are suffering a lot. This was not clear in the beginning, but nowadays, this is by far the biggest source of customers that we have, is to partner with these accounting firms, implementing our systems in order to guarantee 100% tax compliance for both the accounting firms, which in the end of the day is we're granting full compliance for the end customers, which are the business owners, right?
Very cool. I've joked with other people on other episodes about this to some extent. And I've talked with you about it as well, about how expensive the cheap options can be in Brazil. And if you choose the wrong law firm, so you were at Neto, which is our partner at Teddy, and I imagine you guys work with them at BHub, or your accounting partner. It's funny to me because Brazil is the country of the jeitinho, where you're always looking to find a cheap way or cut corners to do different things. But with business structures and taxes, skipping these steps and cutting corners can really come back to bite you. And so you shared the story a little bit about your second exit. Are there any other stories that you can share, maybe where folks have tried to cut corners and they've had issues they've run into? Why should the people that are listening to this make sure to do things correctly, to do this tax planning, to do this setup, even if it is slow and bureaucratic?
Great question. So basically in Brazil, if you do not pay the taxes, you are committing a crime, which is subject to jail. And if I'm not mistaken, the minimum penalty on a tax that is paid in delay is 70%. So it's a very high late payment penalty fee. So you definitely need to have a proper support and you need to pay your taxes in due time. Otherwise, you could be subject to jail time or to very heavy penalty fees. This is very important for you to bear in mind and to have proper legal and accounting support and avoid unnecessary and very bad risks. Apart from that, on the legal side, when I was starting my first company, we were the first peer-to-peer lending platform of Brazil. And we were actually the second guys. There was a previous guy that started a couple of months before us. And it was a very innovative entrepreneur, but it was a very rebel one. So basically, he said, I hate banks. We have the biggest spread in the world. So I'm going to create this platform and enable the population to invest in finance other people and businesses. And it created this platform. It was very successful in a very short term until one of the banks saw it and they denounced, they informed the regulators. And then this guy, this entrepreneur suffered a very hard time. He had to pay very high fees and he barely avoided to serve some jail time, but he was convicted in committing a crime because in Brazil, if you're rendering financial services directly without having a proper license, you are also committing a crime. So we're very serious about compliance stuff here. In all regard, KYC, etc., are very restrict. The Brazilian financial infrastructure is very healthy and safe. So you shouldn't, well, at least in my opinion, you shouldn't bear the risk about non-complying with tax and any other type of regulation in Brazil. We are very serious about that. And as we were saying, we're the second to market, we're the first, and eventually we had a very successful exit for PagSeguro, which was the first fintech to be listed in the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, great story. Obviously, that's a little bit of an extreme, this other competitor of yours. What are some of the common mistakes that you see when you start working with businesses that had maybe been trying to handle these things on their own or had been working with other accountants in business solutions? So you talked a little bit about kind of some of the annual compliance that you help with, but what are some of these common mistakes that you see?
I would say that this is linked to the strategy of ours. So the ideal customer for us, we start serving them ever since the incorporation. Why? Because then we can guarantee compliance with the best possible tax regime legally for the customer to pay less taxes and also to have, potentially less bureaucracy and has a facilitated form for them to run their business. Having said that, it's quite common for us that when we start serving a company, we see a lot of small non-compliance. So for instance, these are more of ancillary obligations linked to these additional reporting requirements. So these are not, like, say, the same level of penalty that is applicable when you do not pay your taxes. But again, there's also some penalties. And what happens is that you cannot issue this compliance certificate. And sometimes, depending on your business, or if you are trying to raise new capital, they are for sure going to see if you have the compliance certificates. And if you do not comply with these requirements, you're not going to be able to issue that. So again, it's very challenging for any business to have full compliance with the regulation. We do have the opinion that without technology, this is impossible to have. We are subject to that on a daily basis because every time that we get a customer, we see sometimes minor, sometimes bigger non-compliance issues that could be this small fee of non-performing a necessary reporting requirement, or it could be, not paying the tax and then there's this huge penalty. And we always try to support the customer. There's also possibilities for you the government can finance you in regards to paying your taxes. So they can finance you for a term.
Yeah.
And then you can avoid
Gotcha.
jail time and also eventually actually even the penalty, you can negotiate that. Again, you definitely need a good service providing in both legal and tax accounting services.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme here is certain things you can do Brazilian jeitinho and other things you need the right partners to succeed here in Brazil. So you talked about it a little bit in this last response in terms of some of the compliance that a startup might need in order to raise capital. But how do the challenges differ when you think about startups versus more traditional businesses? And then building on that, what do you see from foreign companies opening operations in Brazil? But maybe we wait and we get to the startups versus traditional businesses, and then we can talk a little bit about foreign companies.
There's a very interesting question. So usually startups, they should incorporate themselves, most of the case, as this Lucro Real.
Lucro Real. Yeah.
Yes. This enables them to not pay taxes on the revenue that they make. Otherwise, they would be paying. So it's a significant savings. So at least 6%, but this could be, even more than 15% of the revenue. Having said that, usually startups, they have expectations in regards to the experience. And sometimes it's an option. So we at BHub, we prefer to have 100% compliance. So we are heavy on informing the customer of every single obligation that they need to comply. But it's not best experience. The traditional accounting firms, they would have this firefighting operation, which happens to most type of companies. But these are not startups. So they are not, let's say, these accrual basis, this Lucro Real regime. So if you have like Lucro Presumido, simple treatment, etc., it's more flexible. So the regulators, they're not that inclined to see what's happening. But if you are a startup or if you apply for this Lucro Real tax regime, you should be aware you need to have proper accounting and proper documentation in order to prepare your company to an eventual analysis by the Brazilian law. If you have more mature type of companies that, regular business, since there is a presumable profit that you make and you're only paying taxes on those, you can actually not worry that much on the accounting documentation for a company.
Yeah, very interesting. And so I asked at the end there, but how do foreign companies or how should foreign companies opening operations in Brazil think about this? Where do foreigners tend to struggle in terms of understanding some of these operating and tax regimes? And I don't know if you have any lessons or advice for them.
Yeah. So firstly, there are two things. So there is this thing, there has become more and more common, which is called Cayman sandwich, which is having a holding in Cayman. And then you have another holding in Delaware or another state in the US. And this would be the single owner of an operational company in Brazil, or there could be a holding here. Why you have that? Because in the eventual liquidity event, maybe potentially you could avoid taxation in the country. And by having this entity abroad, you can also have guarantee that for the relationship among the shareholders, the stakeholders of the company, you can have US law. Because in Brazil, if you have a company here, you are subject to the Brazilian regulation, the Brazilian laws. So this is the first thing for the foreigner to bear in mind. Apart from that, if you're doing business in Brazil and you're incorporating a company here, you need to have a legal representative. It's mandatory. You have to have someone on the ground to receive service of law. So if there is a litigation, you have to have someone here to be the legal representative and to receive service from the justice. So it's mandatory for you to appoint a legal representative. You can pay for those services. We offer those services, for instance, but there are other paralegal entities in accounting firms that offer this service as well. Apart from that, it's very important also for you to have, it's not the same person, but you need to have an attorney, in fact, in order for you to, again, comply with those obligations and those reporting requirements. Usually this is either the lawyer or the accountant. Because again, here we have a monthly mandatory reporting requirements that you need to comply with on a monthly basis. So I would say that these are the most important bureaucracy stuff. And again, this is linked to all the taxes and the ancillary obligations that we mentioned, which are mandatory for any business. So I definitely recommend good service providers in both the legal and the accounting part.
We're going to let you plug BHub in a second because I know we've been talking
Not
around
necessarily,
it.
yes, but you need to have someone supporting you in that regard, for sure.
No, for sure. Like we've talked about, I think that's the main takeaway for sure. So you talked about the Cayman sandwich a little bit in terms of how a foreigner who's setting up a business on their own in Brazil might work. What about a company setting up an entity, an existing company abroad that's setting up an entity here in Brazil? Are they looking at intermediating it through something else as well? Like you mentioned the Cayman sandwich, or are they going direct? And how does that relationship work? I don't know if BHub deals much with that.
Yeah, we deal with that. And then not necessarily you would have this Cayman entity because if it's just a subsidiary, you don't need that. But it's interesting that you ask because usually it makes a lot of sense for you to open a branch here in Brazil. Why? Because basically, if you are selling goods or services to Brazil, you are subject to importation taxes, which are very burdensome. So usually if you're importing services, usually it's around 40% importation taxes. So it's very heavy. So it's usually much more competitive if you open up a branch here in Brazil, which makes you much more competitive because then you're subject to the taxes that we mentioned before, and you have much less burdensome importation taxes. So this is why most companies prefer to open up a branch here. Having said that, usually the most common practice is to have this Brazilian Limitada, which is a 100% subsidiary. And then you have this legal representative and attorney, in fact, to do business here in the country and to receive those services of law. And then by having the attorney, in fact, you can open up a bank account here in order for you to have these, let's say, foreign direct investment here in the country, which is not subject to taxation. And then eventually from time to time, you can pay dividends, which are also not taxed here in the country.
Yeah, I think that probably is a whole other discussion that we don't have time to get into here. But I promised you just now that I'd give you a chance for plugging BHub. So I think that we've really identified that kind of details and process and expertise really matter here. If there's any takeaway, I think that's what this conversation has been about. So you talked about how, to use your words, it's almost impossible to have 100% compliance without technology. So how have you at BHub tried to bring innovation to these bureaucratic and administrative processes?
It was a very painful journey using in Genshi Genbutsu, which is a Toyota production system principle. There's like see for yourself. So in the beginning, we had all this manual process, a lot of people involved in doing these jobs to be done each and every single ancillary or tax obligation. We were doing that manually and documenting the process. So we started with a minus 900% gross margin. And as
very healthy.
Yeah, it was different times. It was 2021, but it was important for us because then we stabilized this process. We documented each process, and this enabled us to then eventually automate this process. So we were orchestrating process, stabilizing then, and then automating. And this led to the fact that nowadays we have 64% gross margin while keeping 100% tax compliance, 100% compliance with a guarantee, in fact. So it was very important for us to start in this manual process to understand what was the level of service, the level of obligation that we need to comply and then implement tech. Because now we currently serve 3,700 customers and it would be impossible for us to do that without technology. It was a long, painful journey, but it was very important for us to start doing that manually, stabilizing that, and then empowering us through technology to serve these thousands of customers that we serve now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think I've talked about it before, but labor can be quite inexpensive in Brazil. And obviously you don't want to run at a 900% margin for a long time, but you can throw people at a problem in Brazil in a way that you can't in a lot of other markets. And I think that's what's probably prevented some of the innovation, but you bringing tech and innovation to the process obviously lets you create that positive margin and a business hopefully of a different scale as you go forward. So congratulations on the journey and congratulations coming out the other side.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. But please bear in mind the fact that we still have a lot to do, a lot to improve. We are still in the early days.
Always, every day.
Yeah. We're still not 3 years old. So definitely we have a ton of room to improve. And this is something that was a hard choice that we had to make. So most of the technology, even today, it happens behind the scenes. It's Chupacabra that aggregate the tax receipts. It's Consumo that categorizes every transaction that we register. So a lot of things happens behind the scenes. So nowadays, we are just starting to improve the UX for it because we started focusing 100% in guaranteeing the compliance with all the regulation, all the bureaucracy stuff. And right now we are finally advancing in providing better UX for the end customer. And we hope.
Yeah, there's always a lot of infrastructure to build, right? I think that's the key takeaway is for something to be easy, it's oftentimes quite complex on the back end. But this has been really great. I want to head towards the end. I appreciate you taking so much time to chat with us. I always like to ask my guests, what does the expression Brazil is not for beginners mean to you?
Yeah. So I would say that it's very dangerous for an entrepreneur to simplify or to take for granted to do business in Brazil. Actually, it's a very cumbersome, very difficult environment for you to do business at. And I think you absolutely need a professional support in those to make sure that you are compliant with the applicable tax regulations mainly, because otherwise you could be even subject to some jail time, which is definitely something that I do not recommend.
No, something that you certainly want to avoid at all costs if you can.
Yeah.
Are there any Brazilian expressions or habits that you really like or that you think foreigners struggle to understand?
I think it's this paradox, right? So we are renowned worldwide for having this jeitinho, to be this flexible, we'll find a way, etc. But at the same time, we're extremely well developed in terms of tax bureaucracy and payments, etc. So the government is seeing all of that. We're very serious about compliance, especially in the tax part. It's a paradox because it's fully digitalized. The government seeing that. And if you don't do things right, eventually you're going to be subject to very high penalties and even some jail time. So I think it's the paradox. We're flexible, but come on, we take it very serious, the laws and regulations here in Brazil.
For sure. I like this word paradoxical. It's a good one to explain Brazil. I always talk about the extremes. It's the greatest place and the worst place. And there's wealth and poverty and all of the different things. And paradoxical is a great word for that. So, Jorge, this was really great. I really appreciate you giving us so much time. And we only stayed high level in terms of the types of taxes and the types of business structures and all of these things that you spend all day thinking about and working on. How can people reach out to you if they'd like to engage with you? So if people are interested in learning more or they want to learn about BHub services or anything along those lines, how should people engage with you and with BHub?
Perfect. So just reach bhub.com. We would be very proud, very happy to serve you guys. And considering everything that we discussed here is just better for you to focus in the core of your business and delegate everything else to BHub, which will save you a lot of time and money to focus on what you do best, which is the core of your business. That's what we would recommend. There are also very good other service providers, but in the back office part, we do think that we have a very strong offering.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jorge. Really appreciate it. This was really great. Thanks again for all the time and the insights.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you and appreciate also the questions and the open conversation. Thank you.
Hope our audience enjoyed. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks again, Jorge.
No, thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced by Amanda Villela and edited by Veronica Medina. You can find more episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on our Substack page. We love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.